Tonight, I want to invite you to come on an expedition of the imagination, one you do in your mind. But before we leave this place in our imagination, just look around at the place we're at, the things you can see, fantastic stars and the remainder of the sunset, and where some of us can see it, the moon. Look around at the things you see and listen to the things you can hear. Not only the lap of the waves, but the wind around the point, which we'll feel as we move back later in the night. And this place is always a place with beauty and lots of different weather conditions which we've experienced in this camp. But now I want you to come in a time machine that will be more marvellous than Doctor Who's machine, because I want you to come in your imagination a trip of 4,000 years back in time. Back beyond when Captain Cook sailed into Botany Bay, back beyond when Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic in his little ship to the new land, back beyond when Muhammad taught his followers in Mecca, back beyond 2,000 years ago when Jesus taught his followers beside another lake, back another 2,000 years to 4,000 years ago. And in your imagination, your time machine stops and lands you here on the shores of Lake Victoria, not called that then, with the water a little different and the edges of the land a little different. But here 4,000 years ago, you would have seen the light of campfires around the edges of these lakes, because here 4,000 years ago were the Kurnai people, 5 Aboriginal tribes that lived along the Gippsland coast. Here 4,000 years ago they fished, they gathered shellfish and left the piles of their shells around the shores. They cut bark from trees and made canoes. They hunted kangaroos and cared for their children. And it was that way for many, many centuries. And now let your time machine jump most of that 4,000 years until it's just 160 years ago, and look around this place. And this time there are white skins, people with sheep and guns. And later they cut an entrance from the lakes through the sand dunes at a place they called reasonably Lakes Entrance, so that ships could come around from Melbourne and Western Port Bay, and you would have seen paddling past with their big wheels on the side of them, paddle steamers passing our site here, going up to the Port of Sale with provisions from Melbourne and to bring out the wool that the settlers took from the sheep. And there were terrible killings and disease. And when the first settlers came here, there were between 2,000 and 3,000 Kurnai. And 30 years later, there were around 300 Kurnai. So this place is a beautiful and a terrible place. And the people who lived before us have made it that way by what they did and how they lived. And we hope that you'll be part of the next generation that will find better ways for people to live together even though they're different, with respect and with understanding. Now come on a much shorter memory trip for which you don't need your time machine. Just 7 days ago, you remember the bus, the trip down and the gate, and most people you didn't know, and the journey you walked with your luggage into the hall where you met the others in your patrol, wondered what they'd be like. Maybe you still wonder what they'd be like. And you went to your tent and of course were surprised at the comfortable accommodation provided with the soft bedding there for your comfort and delight in your tent. and you began activities. Think of the things in the past week that you've done, the boats you've been in, canoes, kayaks, launch, Nagan chaser, escort, and perhaps especially of the places you've been to. Bungaram, Cooinda Island Canoes X, Rottamar Island, the Banksia Bush site. As you think about those places, is the one that was your favourite? Think of the meals you've eaten, provided by the cooks, and those wonderful things you cooked yourselves over open expedition fires. And think of the campfires that you've sat around. In your mind now, think of the campfires you've been at and picture the glow of the fire on the faces of the people in your group on each expedition. And is the one that is a special memory, the one that you would think of if you were thinking about your overnight expeditions? If there is, take it with you when you go tomorrow. And now I'm going to invite you to share in the quiet lantern walk and the Cooinda story. After our musos sing for us, I'm going to tell you a story, one of the stories that is told on the last night of Cooinda. Some of you will have heard it before, but a lot has happened to you and you've developed a lot as a person since you heard it, and you'll hear it differently. It's a story about another place, other people, and long ago. But it can be, if you want it to be, a story about you as it can be a story about me. And after the story, in fact from now, we ask you if you would continue as you are now and not talk, but allow each person to follow their own thoughts. And after the story, Andrew will lead us with a lantern along the beach, and if you carry the lanterns that you're carrying in your right hand, you'll see the reflections of the lanterns in the lake as you walk. We'll walk in a single file up to the point, and you'll hear the crunch of your feet on the sand and the gravel. And sometimes you'll see luminescence as your feet disturb the red algae that throws out light where the sand is wet. And you'll see the light of Point Turner flashing to guide ships and boats around Point Turner at night. And when you get to the point, you'll feel more wind on your face and hear the ripple of small waves. You'll see the lights of Paynesville across the lake. And we'll walk down the beach, past where the sailing boats are, and past where the canoes are racked, and up the steps, and into the hall, and place the lanterns on the tables in the hall for a lantern-light supper. A time for memories and for remembering what is special for you. And our musos will play and sing for us.
When your day is long and the night is yours alone, when you're sure you've had enough, it's like I know. Don't let yourself go, 'cause everybody cries. Sometimes.
In a distant land a long time ago, long before settlers came to that land, on the great prairies there lived a tribe of peace-loving Indians. And across the prairie plains from where they lived, they could see in the distance a great range of rugged mountains. And as the tribe went about their life, catching bison, using the skins for their housing and their clothes, hunting, caring for their children, they gathered at night round fires, and as people did since the beginning of time, they told stories of the land where they lived, of the sun and the moon, of wind and rain, of their brothers the animals, and they told stories of the mountains that were strange to them. And especially they told stories of one mountain that towered above the others and that they called the Mountain of the Chief. And it happened one night that the chief of the tribe called the people of the tribe into the circle of the fire as a council. And he said to them, "I have been your chief for many moons, and soon it will be time for me to die, and someone else must be your chief. He who would be chief must climb the mountain of the chief." And he asked for who would volunteer for such a challenge. And into the circle of the firelight, 3 braves stepped forward: Moana, Nokado and Wowasa. In those days, when they knew some things and didn't know others, as people will look back on our day and see that we knew some things and didn't know others, they had not yet learned that women as well as men could share the leadership of their tribe. We know that it can be girls or boys or women or men who could stand forward in that circle and take that challenge. But in those days it was 3 men who stood forward: Moana, Nokado and Wowasa. And the chief looked at them, and he felt his spirits lift when he saw that truly each one of them had the qualities that could make them a chief of the tribe. And he said to them, "One thing I ask of you, that you bring me some sign you have reached your journey's goal." And the next morning, as the sun rose across the plains towards the mountain, the 3 men set off to climb the mountain of the chief. And in the days that followed, as the people went about their work hunting and caring for their children and cooking their meals, they often looked across the plain towards the mountain, and they thought of the dangers there, of cliffs and crevasse, of cold and rain, of bears and snakes, and they thought of the 3 climbing the mountain of the chief. And as the days passed, there was less talk as they gathered round the fire at night and wondered how Moana and Nokado and Wowasa were handling that terrible challenge that they had taken. And then one night, as they sat around the fire, into the circle of firelight, a figure came, and they saw Moana come up to the chief, and they saw he held in his hand a branch with a strange and beautiful leaf that they had never seen before. And Moana said, "O great chief, where I climbed on the mountain of the chief, there was this thing of great beauty." And the chief looked at the leaves of the plant, and he remembered the time many years before when he had climbed the mountain of the chief, and that these trees with these leaves were low upon the mountain. And he said, "O Moana, true beauty is in achieving your journey's goal and in a life well lived. Why was it you stopped before you reached your journey's goal?" And Moana bowed his head and left the circle of the firelight, and he knew, and his people knew, that he would not be their chief. And later that night a second figure came into the firelight, and they saw Nakado walk up towards the chief, and they saw that something glistened in his hands in the light of the fire. And Nakado stood before the chief and said, "O great chief, where I climbed high upon the mountain of the chief, I found this treasure of gold." And the chief remembered the time many years before when he had climbed the mountain of the chief and had seen where the gold glistened in the rock and knew that it was short of the top of the mountain. And he said, "O Nakado, true treasure is in achieving your life's journey's goals and in a life well lived. Why was it you stopped before reaching your journey's goal?" And Nakado bowed his head and left the circle of the light, and he knew and the people knew that he would not be their chief. And the next day, people looked frequently towards the mountain and thought about the dangers of cliffs and crevasse, of cold and of rain, and of snakes and of bears, and wondered about Wowasa. And that night, late in the night, a weary figure entered the circle of the firelight, and they all looked to see what he would hold in his hands before the chief. And as he stood before the chief and opened his hands, you could hear around the circle of the tribe, because there was nothing in his hands. And Wowasa said, "O great chief, where I stood on the top of the mountain of the chief, there was nothing I could bring, neither plant nor rock. But great chief, where I stood, I could see the splendid vision of the sun shining on the great ocean." And the chief remembered the time many years before when he had stood on that spot and seen the sun shining on the distant ocean. And he knew that Wowasa had achieved his journey's goal and had courage to reach the very top of the mountain. And he said, "Truly, you reached your journey's goal and you shall be our chief." And Wowasa became the chief of the tribe, and he ruled his people well, with wisdom and courage, and led them in the ways of peace.